Front matter of Stories of the Coal Mine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. Front matter. Preface. I beg to acknowledge my indebtedness to Major Lindsay of Sunderland, who placed at my disposal a sketch of his son's career and gave me permission to reproduce the photograph of the hero of Usworth. To Mr. William Dodd of Audley fame for a similar kindness, and to the proprietors of Punch for the use of the poem in Chapter 8. Signed, Frank Mundell, London, December 1895. Epigraph. Old King Cole was a merry old soul. I'll move the world, quoth he. My England's high, and rich and great, but greater she shall be. And he called for the pick, and he called for the spade, and he called for his miners bold. And it's dig, he said, in the deep, deep earth, you'll find my treasures better worth than mines of Indian gold. Old King Cole was a merry old soul, a merry old soul is he. May he never fail in the land we love, who has made us great and free. While his miners mine and his engines work through all our happy land, we shall flourish fair in the morning light, and our name and our fame and our might and our right in the front of the world shall stand. By Charles Mackay. End of front matter. Section 1 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1. King Cole. The traveller from London to the north by the Midland Railway must needs pass through one or more of the great coalfields. On all sides, as far as the eye can reach, mounds of black and burning rubbish are seen, which tell of years of labour expended in getting coal. It is well named the Black Country, for it is really the land of coal. The two largest English coalfields lie on the borders of the sea, and the coal-laden trucks run right down to the vessels which carry the black diamonds far across the ocean. One of these great deposits is situated in the west, and forms the famous Welsh Basin, which is said to be the largest and deepest in Europe. The other extends towards the east, with Newcastle as its centre. It is said that as much as one half of this coalfield lies under the North Sea. There an army of upwards of 40,000 miners produce as much coal as the whole of France. It would be impossible to exaggerate the importance of coal to the British people. To the possession of this valuable mineral we owe our position as the chief manufacturing nation on the globe. But for the mines of coal, our country would have made little progress during the last century, and much of its area, now rich in commercial and agricultural prosperity, would be little more than a wilderness. Those who live in our large towns have an especial right to know all about coal. The very fact that they are living in a city of thousands of inhabitants instead of in a little village is simply owing to the circumstance of coal being found in the neighbourhood. Let us consider for a moment a few of the chief uses of coal. It feeds the fires that warm our dwellings and cook our food. From it is obtained the gas which lights our houses and streets, the steam which drives the engine along the iron road and the ship across the sea. It works the printing press, wields the hammer, lifts great weights, draws heavy loads, grinds corn, spins cotton and wool, weaves cloth, and yields rich and brilliant dyes of every shade and colour. We are able to manufacture for the world, and our manufacturing power is only limited by our coal supply. Why has cotton emigrated from India, Egypt, America, and other far-off lands and made its home in Lancashire, where today cotton is king, and where populous towns, huge factories, and hundreds of thousands of workers have been prepared and brought together for its reception? Why is wool carried thousands of miles from the great sheep runs of Australia, South Africa, and South America to be manufactured into cloth in the Yorkshire mills? How does it happen that for miles around such cities as Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield and Glasgow, the country is lighted up with furnaces by day and night, and is for ever resounding with the clang and clash and roar of steam hammers, engines and other machinery? The answer to all that is simply coal. Manufacturers use immense quantities of coal, therefore they must set up their factories where a supply can be easily obtained, and thus save the cost of carriage. Any other plan would enormously increase the expense of production, and everything would be proportionately dearer. When coal and iron are found in separate districts, it is cheaper to carry the iron to the coal than it would be to take the coal to the iron. Devonshire produces china clay, but there is none in Staffordshire. Devonshire, however, has no coalfields, and Staffordshire has. The china clay is therefore carried to Staffordshire to be made into pottery. From this example, it will be seen that but for the presence of coal in large quantities in our country, our metals and other productions would have to be sent to coal-producing countries to be manufactured, and our industries would never have assumed their present enormous proportions. The United Kingdom yields nearly one half of the coal production of the globe. From about 4,000 collieries, nearly 165 million tonnes are obtained every year. Coal mining and the coal trade together give employment to more than 500,000 persons. At this rate, how long will our coal last, is a question which has often been asked with no little amount of anxiety. Several years ago a reply was given by a parliamentary commission which, after most exhaustive inquiries, came to the conclusion that there was enough coal to last for 1,000 years. It is comforting to know that we shall not be under the necessity of finding a new fuel, but one cannot help wondering what will happen at the end of the 1,000 years. Will England have to abandon her supremacy and take a lower place among the nations? That is improbable. Before the last bag of coal is consumed, science, which has done so much in the past, and which is so active in the present, will have discovered some other method of producing that warmth, light and power which we now obtain from coal. That concludes Chapter 1. The section continues with Chapter 2. Black Diamonds. For many ages, wood was man's only fuel. In those days, a large portion of this country was covered with dense forests, and the few inhabitants were scattered over a wide area. As years passed on, and the population increased, the forests became less and less. Men cut down the trees as if their supply would never fail, and at the present time the forests are few in number and small in size, and could not supply the vast population of today with fuel for any length of time. Fortunately for our comfort, nature was not idle during the long years of the past. Ages and ages ago, she deposited beds of coal in every quarter of the globe, and today they afford light and heat to millions of the human race. Down thousands of feet below the surface of the earth, these coal beds are spread sometimes over areas many miles in extent, and promising a supply of fuel for several centuries to come. How or when this great work was accomplished, we do not know. We can only imagine a period far back in the earth's history when wide jungles and vast swamps occupied the sites of the great industrial centres of the world. Gradually, under the influence of the moist atmosphere, the trees and plants became decomposed. As time went on, the swamps were filled up with sand and other substances and sank below the level of the sea. Then water flowed into the hollow thus made, and in process of time another forest was formed, which was in turn depressed and covered with water. In this way, step by step, the coal beds are supposed to have been formed. In appearance, coal is like a mineral, but it has been proved to be of the same nature as the stems, leaves and roots of plants, and has been found to contain numberless vegetable forms. On this account, it has received the name of mineralised vegetable matter. That is to say, it is vegetable substance which has taken a mineral form. Coal is found in the crust of the earth at irregular intervals among sandstone and clay. It is in beds or layers which vary in thickness from 1 to 30 inches and upwards. According to geologists, each coal seam represents a depressed swamp, while the other substances, such as sandstone and clay, mark the various deposits which were brought together by the action of the waters. Among the seams of coal, the fossil roots of trees are frequently found, together with many impressions of plants. Sometimes it happens that the trunks themselves are seen standing erect as they grew, and running up through the seams of coal towards the surface. It is not definitely known which nation first took advantage of these underground stores of fuel, but the Chinese, who have been credited with the discovery and invention of nearly everything in the world, are generally believed to have been acquainted with the use of coal at a very remote period of antiquity. Their workings, however, were of a rude kind, being for the most part only open cuttings. When the exhaustion of the surface coal compelled them to go underground, they took no measures for safety, and fatal accidents were of frequent occurrence. Even at the present day, their operations are conducted on the same primitive scale as they were centuries ago. From the accounts of the early missionaries, we learn that they applied the coal to many industrial uses, such as baking porcelain, drying tea, etc. They also knew how to collect the gas which came from the coal and conveyed it in pipes to places where it was wanted. Little is known about the ancient history of our coal. From the fact that small pieces of coal and quantities of coal ashes have been found among the ruins of many of the Roman stations, it is thought that they were familiar with its use. It is not, however, till long after their departure from the country that coal appears in a list along with other articles of merchandise. Previous to the reign of King John, there appears to be no allusion to the existence of a coal trade in England. At the close of that monarch's conflict with the barons, when by the granting of Magna Charta a greatly increased security was given to subjects in the possession of their lands and rights, and we have evidence of a commencement having been made to work coal and convey it from the north to London. As early as the year 1228, a lane in the metropolis was called Sea Coal Lane, clearly showing that there existed a trade in sea coal, as it was called, on account of it being brought by sea. The mineral fuel was at first only used by a few persons, such as smiths and lime burners. Gradually other workers who used furnaces came to adopt it, but by far the greater number of people it was regarded as an intolerable nuisance, which polluted the atmosphere and caused serious danger to health. In consequence of the agitation which was raised, Edward I issued a proclamation in 1306 forbidding its use in London, and authorising the destruction of the furnaces of those who should persist in using it. But little heed was paid to this mandate, and coal continued to be used almost as much as before. In the reign of Edward II, the export of coal from the Tyne to France was begun. Mention is made of a vessel belonging to the town of Pontoise, which brought a cargo of corn to Newcastle in 1325, and returned laden with coal. In the same year, it also began to be used for domestic purposes in the coal districts. Iron fire grates, or chimneys as they were called, then came into use, for at that time there were no flues in the houses. These chimneys were not fixtures like our modern grates, and could be carried from room to room. They were considered to be a very important article of household furniture, and we are told that they were handed down by will from father to son in succession. At this time also, mention is made of the poker and tongs, these familiar implements of the smith's craft having followed coal from the forge to the grate. It is probable that throughout the 14th and 15th centuries coal was extracted from the beds over most, if not all, of the coalfields of Britain. The statement that Henry III granted the men of Newcastle a licence to dig for coal is in all probability an historical fiction, for in the records of that monarch's reign no mention is made of such a transaction. An examination of the patent roll shows that it was not till 1350 that such a grant was made. In that year the men of Newcastle petitioned for and obtained their first licence from Edward III to dig and to take coals and stone from certain portions of the land outside the walls of the town, on the following terms: The King, to his beloved Mayor and bailiffs and good men of our town of Newcastle upon Tyne, greeting. Because on your part petition has been made to us that we may be willing to concede to you, that in the common ground of the town aforesaid, without the walls of the same town, in places called the Castlefield and the Frith, you may have the power to dig and to take coals and stone from thence as often and in such a way as may seem to you to be expedient. We favourably acceding to your petition in this matter, have caused a licence of this kind to be granted to you. And this to you and others whom it may concern, we signify by the present letter, to have effect during our good pleasure. Witness the King at Westminster, the 1st day of December, by the King himself and Council, and for 20 shillings paid into the Hanaper. After this, the benefits of the mineral fuel became more and more apparent, both for manufacturing and domestic purposes. Then, as now, however, prejudice died hard. The ladies especially objected to the innovation. One writer says, "The nice dames of London would not come into any house or room where sea coals were burned, nor willingly eat of the meat that was roasted with sea coal fire." Their opposition was eventually overcome, and in the year 1400 the mineral fuel was generally used in the metropolis, though it did not come into use throughout England till over 200 years later. Craftsmen in France, even at that early period, looked to Newcastle for their supply of coal, which is spoken of as "that thing that France can live no more without than the fish without water, for without it they can neither make steel work, nor metal work, nor wire work, nor goldsmith work, nor guns, nor no manner of thing that passeth the fire." In 1546 Henry VIII sent to Newcastle an order for 3,000 cauldrons of coal, to be sent to Boulogne with all possible dispatch. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth the coal trade flourished greatly, and to meet the demands a fleet of several hundred ships was employed. In 1615 upwards of 400 vessels were engaged. Half of these were required to supply London, the remainder went to other parts of England. Besides these, a large export trade was carried on by foreign ships. Says a writer of the period, "Besides our own vessels, hither come, even to the mine's mouth, all our neighbouring nations with their ships continually. The French send thither in whole fleets of 50 sail together, serving with our coals all the coast of France, even as far as Bordeaux." 20 years later the fleet had increased to 700 ships and was already regarded as a great nursery of seamen. By the middle of the 17th century it numbered 900 sail. While Newcastle was thus constantly adding to her revenues, the collieries in the west were in anything but a flourishing condition. In the beginning of the 17th century, a small export trade was carried on from Swansea and Milford, the port of Chester. Cumberland and Lancashire also exported small quantities. In the early part of the 18th century, the coal trade at Whitehaven underwent great development. In 1706, Sir James Lowther, the owner of the Whitehaven collieries, determined to improve the workings of his mines. With this end in view, he sent a promising youth, named Carlyle Spedding, to Newcastle to learn the methods employed at the coal metropolis. The young man got work as a hewer, and for a time all went well, till he was severely burned by an explosion of firedamp. The best medical attendance was obtained for the sufferer, and he quickly recovered. But the fact that so much care had been taken of the young collier aroused the suspicion of his fellow workers, and led to his discovery. Having by that time learned enough to enable him to carry on operations at Whitehaven, he returned home. He at once set to work to put his knowledge into practice, and at a place called Saltham he proposed to sink a shaft, which he declared would give access to many acres of coal under the land, and to an unknown extent under the sea. This, the most remarkable colliery enterprise of the day, was begun in 1729, within 20 yards of high water mark. At a depth of 42 fathoms, the miners came upon a bed of coal 2 feet thick. Contrary to their expectations, very little water was found at this point, but instead a strong discharge of firedamp, which was, however, successfully carried off by means of pipes. Spedding carried his workings to a much greater depth than had previously been reached in any other part of the kingdom, carrying the shaft down about 800 feet. The workings were carried under the sea for a considerable distance, so that, as one writer remarks, Sir James's riches in part swim over his head, for ships pass daily above the very ground where his colliers work. Spedding lost his life by an explosion of firedamp in 1755, while discharging his duties in the mines. We now reach the most important epoch in the history of coal mining, which is marked by the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in 1784. His discoveries opened up an entirely new field for the use of coal. Railways, steamboats, factories and iron furnaces multiplied to an enormous extent, and Britain, owing to her wealth in coal and iron, taken advantage of by a people endowed with indomitable energy and high intelligence, was enabled to place herself in the front amongst the nations of the world. That concludes Chapter 2, and is the end of Section 1. Section 2 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3. The Safety Lamp. The phosphorescent gleam of fish suspended from the roof is said to have been the first means of illumination adopted in coal mines. The light thus obtained must have served to do little more than make the darkness visible, and candles came into use at an early period. As the mines were made deeper owing to the exhaustion of the coal near the surface, it was found that danger from explosions of firedamp increased enormously, and many workings had to be abandoned for want of a suitable light. The first step taken to overcome this difficulty was the invention of the steel mill, a machine consisting of a thin disc of steel 5 or 6 inches in diameter, which was made to revolve at great speed by turning a handle. As the disc revolved, a piece of flint was applied to the edge, and a continuous flow of brilliant sparks was emitted, sufficient to enable the miners to carry on their work in places where the use of candles was impossible. The use of this machine was found to be attended with some risk, and that, together with the poor light it gave, prevented its general use. Explosions of firedamp were unusually frequent in the Northumberland pits about the beginning of the present century, and were attended with considerable loss of life. On the 25th of May 1812, an explosion at Felling Colliery near Gateshead resulted in a more appalling mortality than had ever before been known. Out of 121 miners, only 32 escaped alive, and 3 of these afterwards died of their injuries. The terrible nature of this disaster caused men to ask if nothing could be done to prevent the recurrence of so dire a fatality. A London barrister named Wilkinson then suggested that a society should be established for the purpose of inquiring whether any and what methods of security could be adopted for the prevention of such accidents. In consequence of this suggestion, a Society for the Prevention of Accidents in Coal Mines was formed at Bishop Wearmouth on the 1st of October 1813. Sir Humphrey Davy was at this time at the height of his fame, and one of the members of the Society proposed that the great scientist should be asked to consider the question. A letter was accordingly sent, and in reply Davy wrote, "It will give me great satisfaction if my chemical knowledge can be of any use in an inquiry so intensely interesting to humanity." Davy afterwards visited Newcastle, where he made a few slight experiments and expressed himself hopeful of being able to help the miners. A safety lamp had already been invented by Dr. Clanny of Sunderland. His plan was to insulate the air in the lamp from the foul air in the mine by means of water. The supply of air necessary to secure combustion was kept up by bellows. Though this lamp was safe, it was very inconvenient, and no great use was made of it. What was wanted was a lamp which miners could carry about with them, and which, while giving sufficient light, would be perfectly safe. By a series of experiments, Davy found that in tubes, the 1/7 of an inch in diameter, explosive mixtures of air and damp could not be fired. Following up his discoveries, he invented a safety lamp, which was called after him the Davy. It consists of an oil-fed wick enclosed in a wire gauze cylinder 6 inches long by 1½ in diameter, with a double piece of gauze on the top. When a light thus protected is introduced into an explosive mixture of air and firedamp, the flame is seen gradually to enlarge until it fills the cylinder. When this happens, the miner should retire to a place of safety, for though no explosion can take place while the gauze is sound, yet at that high temperature the metal is easily broken, and a single flaw in the gauze may cause an explosion. In the autumn of 1815, Sir Humphrey went down some of the most fiery mines in the north of England to prove the worth of his invention. The result of his experiments was highly satisfactory. Everyone was impressed with a sense of the absolute safety of the lamp, and the praises of its inventor were sounded on every side. So strong was the feeling of gratitude that the coal owners invited him to a public dinner and presented him with a service of plate to the value of £2,000. Asked on one occasion why he had not taken out a patent to protect the invention and thus secure a share in the profits which would follow its extended use, Davy replied, "I never thought of such a thing. My sole object was to serve the cause of humanity, and if I have succeeded, I am amply rewarded in the gratifying reflection of having done so." While Davy was experimenting on ways and means to disarm firedamp, the problem was absorbing the attention of the father of the railways, at that time an engine wright at Killingworth Colliery near Newcastle. One day in 1814, a man rushed into Stevenson's cottage with the alarming news that the deepest main in the colliery was on fire. Without loss of time, he hurried to the pit mouth. Pushing his way through crowds of weeping women and children, he took his place in the cage, and in a firm voice ordered the engine man to lower. On reaching the bottom of the shaft, he found the miners wild with panic. They attempted to make a rush for the cage, but Stevenson called out, "Stand back! If there are 6 men among you with courage enough to follow me, come on and we will put out the fire." His calmness and decision had the desired effect, and the panic was overcome. The necessary materials and tools for building a wall were quickly conveyed to a spot which he indicated, and in a short time the fire died out from want of air, and a great calamity was averted. Several workmen had, however, lost their lives by suffocation, and the cause of the disaster was naturally the subject of conversation for some time. Stevenson, who had already earned a reputation for ingenuity among his fellow workmen, was asked by one of them if nothing could be done to overcome the fire damp. He replied that he thought something might be invented. "Well," replied the man, "the sooner you start the better, for the price of coal mining now is pitmen's lives." Accordingly, Stevenson set to work and prepared a lamp, which he thus describes. "My first lamp had a chimney at the top and a tube at the bottom to admit the atmospheric air, or fire damp and air, to feed the burner. I was not aware of the precise quantity required to feed the combustion, but to know what quantity was necessary, I had a slide at the bottom of the first tube in my lamp to admit such a quantity of air as might be eventually found necessary." In company with 2 of the colliery officials, he descended a pit, in a part of which the air had purposely been made foul. At the critical moment, the courage of his companions forsook them, and they left Stevenson to go on alone. With unshaken confidence, he continued on his way. When the lamp came in contact with the fire damp, the flame at first increased and then went out, but there was no explosion. Satisfied with the result of his first experiment, he returned to his companions. They never expected to see him alive again, and when he told them what had happened, they were incredulous. Wishing to see for themselves, they accompanied him into the workings, and the experiment was repeated several times, with exactly the same result. The lamp, however, gave but a poor light, and it was faulty in a few other details. Stevenson therefore determined to improve it. On the 4th of November he tested his second lamp, which burned better and was perfectly safe. In this lamp the air was admitted by 3 small tubes inserted in the bottom, instead of by one large tube. Still he was not satisfied, and he contrived a third lamp, which answered all his expectations. This lamp, known as the Geordie, came into use in the Killingworth colliery in December 1815. A great deal of controversy followed the invention of the safety lamp, one party claiming the honour for Sir Humphry Davy, the other for George Stephenson. From the evidence it appears that the principles of construction were discovered by Stephenson before Davy brought his powerful genius to bear on the subject. Thus, working from a common knowledge towards a common goal, it was but natural that an almost exactly similar result should be achieved. The principle having been once known, it was easy to adopt and multiply practical applications of it. The inventors of the safety lamp are worthy of the highest praise. By its means, many catastrophes have been avoided, and extensive mines opened up, which might have lain for years unworked. And, more valuable still, it makes the firedamp itself give warning of the danger it threatens. At the present day, both lamps are still in use, though not exactly in their original forms. The strong current of air which is sent through the workings renders them no longer safe. The modern Davy, or, as miners call it, the tin can Davy, is enclosed in a lantern. It, however, gives but an indifferent light and is rapidly falling out of use. The Geordie of to-day has a glass cylinder protected by wire gauze with a cap of perforated copper. Small openings below the glass admit the necessary air, which, when it becomes highly explosive, extinguishes the light so that the lamp does not get overheated. Other lamps better adapted to the new and improved conditions of ventilation are now largely used in our collieries. These will doubtless in time give place to the great illuminant, the electric light. That concludes Chapter 3. The section continues with Chapter 4. The Mine. A trip underground into the dominions of King Coal is a most exciting experience, and one which few persons care to indulge in a second time. Everyone is tolerably familiar with the external appearance of a colliery. The framing, which supports the large pulleys over the drawing shaft, the sheds and engine houses, the sidings with their train of wagons, and in the background the workshops and other buildings need no description. One engine house contains a ponderous drum, round which wind innumerable coils of wire rope to draw the coal and the miners to the surface. In another stands the pumping engine that is constantly at work keeping the mine free from water. Here also may be seen the weighing machine, on either side of which stands a check weighman, one to look after the interests of the masters, the other to look after the interests of the men. As each truck is weighed, they enter the amount into huge ledgers. The coal is then tipped into an inclined screen or sifter, that the small stuff may be riddled out. The larger pieces pass down a funnel into a railway truck placed below. The smaller pieces are sold as nuts, while the rest is known as slack. The shaft, a deep hole like a great well, is the highway from the bank, as the pit mouth is called, to the mine. Up and down the shaft all day long travels the cage, bringing coal to the surface and taking back the empty trucks to be refilled. By this means the men are also conveyed up and down. The cage is not unlike a lift or elevator, and answers exactly the same purpose. Every mine must have at least 2 shafts and a circulation of air, very much like that of the blood in the human body. One shaft is used to admit, or downcast, the fresh air, the other to upcast the foul air. Into the innermost recesses of the workings, air is carried by different sets of roads or passages, one being devoted to the fresh air current passing inwards, the other to the impure air returning from the working places. In going down a mine, the motion of the cage is felt very keenly at first. The floor seems to be giving way. Then, in a minute or two, the motion is that of ascending. This peculiar sensation is caused by the gradual slackening of the speed as the cage nears the bottom. The time occupied in the descent varies according to the depth of the shaft and the power of the engine. For instance, at the Parkgate pit at Rotherham, 1,600 tons of coal are raised in 10 hours through a shaft nearly a quarter of a mile in depth. This distance is travelled in little more than half a minute. The deepest coal pit in England is the Ashton Moss colliery near Manchester, which is over half a mile below the surface. The pit's eye, as the foot of the shaft is called, is lined with brick, and from it branch other passages which lead to the different parts of the workings, in some mines over a mile distant. Here are also the boilers for working any engines which may be used underground, the stables and the lamp cabin. The lamps are kept under the charge of a man whose business is to see that they are in good working order and securely fastened so that they cannot be opened. From this point, narrow lines of rails connect the different parts of the colliery with the shaft. Along these lines or tramways, small trucks of coal are drawn by ponies. In some parts of the mine, where the roof is too low to allow a pony to pass along, this work is done by men and boys called trammers. It is almost needless to say that only a small number of the miners are actually hewers of coal. There are hewers, drivers, engine men, stablemen, and 100 others, all of whom are pitmen in the sense that they are employed in and about a pit. The underground stables, in which the ponies employed in the pit are housed, are hewn out of the solid rock or coal. The ponies do not seem to suffer from the darkness. They are fat and their skins are glossy. Once they are taken down to work in the mine, they seldom see the light of the sun again, unless some unlooked-for event, such as a strike, necessitates them being brought to the surface. It is astonishing how quickly the pit ponies learn what they have to do, in many cases making a driver almost unnecessary. There is an interesting instance recorded of the intelligence of these animals. At a small colliery near Barnsley, the ponies, though working daily underground, were stabled at the surface. Many of them knew as well as the men when the day's work came to an end, and, without guidance, would make their way at top speed to the shaft. Taking their places in the cage, they would stand quiet and motionless while they were being drawn to the surface. The chief gallery or principal passage is called the dip head level. The sides and roof are supported by wood and brickwork as carefully finished off as a railway tunnel. In some places the roof is so low that the miners, going to their work, have to walk almost double. Here and there in the walls are little recesses called refuge holes, in which the miners stand while the trains of coal-laden trucks pass on their way to the shaft. Branching from the main passage are numerous side galleries, in which the miners are hard at work, getting coal. Each man has a separate portion of the pit assigned to him, and he is expected to obtain as large pieces of coal as possible, because small stuff is of very little value. Stripped to the waist, and armed with a short, sharp-pointed pick, the hewer goes to work. He cuts a groove in the seam to the depth of 3 or 4 feet under the piece to be got out. To do this he has to work lying on his side, a most unnatural position, in which he wields his pick at great disadvantage. When the coal has been sufficiently undermined, it then either falls by its own weight, or is brought down by wedges driven along the top, or by a charge of gunpowder. In some collieries, machines are employed to undercut the coal, and when they are more generally adopted, they will relieve the miner of much of his hardest work. Towards the end of the gallery, the roof becomes gradually lower. In these places, the colliers have frequently to work where there is no more than 18 inches between the floor and the roof. The terrible strain of working in such a confined space tells seriously on the health of the miners, even under the most perfect system of ventilation, and many who have come from the plough with a fresh, healthy colour in their cheeks are often transformed in less than a month into hollow-cheeked, pale-faced men. That concludes Chapter 4. And is the end of Section 2. Section 3 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5. The Miner. The coal miner is foremost among those who are constantly risking their lives and limbs to obtain a livelihood. His life is one of constant and terrible peril, and the conditions under which he labours are of the most trying description. Shut up in the earth, and dependent entirely on his lamp for light, all is as night to him. The changes which follow the earth's daily revolutions are unknown to him as he performs his work. The scorching heat of summer and the piercing cold of winter do not affect him. The temperature of the earth, unless varied by the air driven to him by the machinery of the mine or by the heat of his lamp, is the temperature in which he performs his work. Notwithstanding the fact that the regulations for the ventilation of mines and the use of lights seem as complete as experience and science can make them, disasters are of constant occurrence. It is estimated that every 150,000 tons of coal raised in Great Britain cost one collier's life. 1,000 deaths by mining accidents is the yearly average, and besides this, there must be reckoned the numerous instances in which severe injuries are inflicted. Flood, firedamp, and chokedamp are the miner's deadly foes. By one or other of them he may be drowned, burned, or suffocated. There is danger, too, from falls of rock and earth, which may cause immediate death, or enclose him in a living tomb. Modern investigation has revealed another danger, namely the presence of large quantities of coal dust, which is very liable to be blown into the air and to catch fire from any naked light. The simple expedient of keeping the floor of the mine well watered is found to act as a reliable preventive of disaster from this cause. As the coal is removed, water collects in the empty places, and sometimes vast underground lakes have been formed. Mines from which all the coal has been removed are a fruitful source of danger, for water rapidly accumulates in the disused workings. One chance blow of a miner's pick, tapping some hidden and unknown reservoir, may cause an inrush of water, which, coursing through the galleries like a river, will cause a terrible loss of life. Firedamp is an inflammable gas which often forms in the pit. It is similar to the gas we burn in our houses. We have an illustration of this when we go into a room in which there is an escape of gas, with a light, when an explosion of a more or less serious nature will be the result. This is exactly what happens, only on a very much larger scale, in a coal mine, when firedamp comes in contact with a naked light. No event, however disastrous, can be more dreadful than an explosion of firedamp. Far and near, everything is shattered. Horses, men, doors, machinery, in fact, all that stands in the way is destroyed. Frequently masses of coal, rock and timber are thrown up the shaft high into the air. Above ground, the shock is as if an earthquake were taking place. Not a pane of glass for a wide distance round the scene of the explosion remains unbroken. To all this must be added the terror of the people, the cries of the children, and the wailing of the women, who, fearing the loss of those nearest and dearest to them, flock to the mine in crowds to learn the worst. Even then, the imagination fails to grasp the horrors of the situation. Chokedamp, or carbonic acid gas, follows in the wake of firedamp, and is perhaps the miner's most dreaded enemy. The atmosphere becomes foul, his lamp grows dim and warns him of his peril. He starts to run to a place of safety. His lamp is extinguished. In the black darkness he stumbles and falls, the poisonous vapour overtakes him, and another death is added to the long roll of mortality, on which is written the price of coal. How few there are who think for a moment of all the toils and tears it gives to warm the shins of London city. At the present day, the collier's lot, though still far from being a bright one, is much better than it was half a century ago. 50 or 60 years since, miners were practically slaves. The men worked entirely naked, except for caps and shoes. There was no system of ventilation worthy of the name, and so great was the perspiration from the bodies of the workers that a person standing 6 yards away from where they were working could not see them. Women, and even boys and girls of 5 and 6 years of age, worked in the pit, where they performed the labours of horses, carrying coal out of the workings. The underground manager had a thick, heavy yardstick, and if a lad failed to waggon the amount of coal required, or did not do his work in due time, the manager beat the poor lad unmercifully, unchecked by any law to prevent him. The experiences of an old coal miner may be taken as an example of the work which many of these poor children performed in mines. He says, "My daily work was to waggon 96 boxes of coal. I travelled for each box in and out of the working, 560 yards. A box contained about 500 weight of coal, which made 24 tons waggoned in the day. If you multiply the number of boxes waggoned, 96, by 560, the distance travelled for each box, it gives 30 miles and a half as the total distance travelled in the pit. As I had 5 miles to walk to and from my work, I covered altogether 35.5 miles per day, at the same time bringing out 24 tons of coal. I had to rise in the morning at 4:30 and returned home between 6 and 7 in the evening. When I sat down in the house at the end of my day's work, I was unable to put one leg over the other, or to take one off the other, unless I lifted it on and off with my hands. Every morning my limbs were stiff with the previous day's work, but the stiffness had to be removed and my limbs made pliable again by sweating and not by resting." Lord Shaftesbury, the great philanthropist, was the first to call public attention to the terrible state of the women and children in the mines. His eloquent and pathetic descriptions of their sufferings touched the heart of the nation, and in 1847 a bill was passed by Parliament, forbidding the employment of women in the underground workings. In Cumberland and Lancashire, women and girls are employed on the surface in weighing and screening coal. Boys are not allowed underground till they are 13 years of age. The idea that colliers were a coarse and brutal class of men once had a wide currency. There were doubtless instances to be met with here and there that gave colour to such a belief. But no more unjust charge was ever brought against a body of men who have played a part in their country's history, the importance of which has been but recently recognised. Of late years, the social and industrial development of the miner has been rapid, and the grime of the pit is no longer a necessary indication of his mental condition. Rough in manners and speech they may be, but their actions have placed them among the world's heroes. Never has the cry for help of an entombed comrade fallen on deaf ears. Over and over again they have imperilled their lives to rescue the living and recover the dead, and in every case they have displayed a heroism pathetic in its earnestness and worthy of the highest traditions of our race. That concludes Chapter 5. The section continues with Chapter 6. All Dead. "I wonder what's keeping 'em," said a collier's wife to her neighbour in Old Hartley one morning in 1862. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and the men engaged on the night shift at the Hartley colliery had not returned to their homes. The women in the cottages in Old and New Hartley stood at their doors on that cold January morning, wondering what had caused the delay. There had been no news of an accident. What could be the matter? Their suspense was soon ended. News arrived, and soon loud cries and lamentations filled the bleak Northumbrian air. Groups of women stood in the streets weeping and wringing their hands. The sound of hurrying feet was heard, and then in breathless haste the question was asked, "What has happened?" "The iron beam has broken, and the shaft of the pit is blocked." With a sigh of relief, the questioners proceeded on their way to the pit mouth to await developments, thankful, meanwhile, that it was no worse. Little did they think how serious was the disaster that had occurred. The iron beam, which had suddenly snapped, weighed 40 tons, and half of it had gone crashing down the shaft, as the cage containing 8 men was ascending. 4 of the miners were hurled to the bottom of the shaft, where they almost immediately expired. 4 succeeded in clinging to the broken cage till they were rescued. The broken beam had formed part of a large engine, which was constantly used for pumping the water out of the mine, and when the engine was thus rendered useless, the water flowed into the workings at the rate of 1,500 gallons a minute. In its fall, the mighty mass tore away all the woodwork that lined the shaft, and completely blocked the passage with an immense quantity of stones, earth, and rubbish, and cut off the retreat of 200 miners, nearly all the male inhabitants of Old and New Hartley. Meanwhile, the crowd of women on the bank were eagerly discussing the situation of their husbands, sweethearts, sons, and brothers. "There's nae great danger," said one. "They ha' plenty of food, and it will nae take long to get them out. They're on the yard seam, and the water canna get to them," remarked another. "It's lucky the mine is free fra bad gas," said a third. "They'll be hame again afore lang." There was only one shaft to the mine, and before the imprisoned men could be rescued, at least 30 feet of rubbish had to be cut through. There was, however, no lack of volunteers, and the Herculean task was commenced without delay. But the shaft was so narrow that few men could work at a time. The removal of the rubbish also proved a more formidable task than had been anticipated, and the difficulty was increased by the torrent of water that poured down upon the men. Still the rescuers persevered, but in spite of their utmost exertions, the progress made was very slow. All night relays of men exhausted themselves in their efforts to make headway. It was feared that the rubbish might at any moment subside and precipitate the men to the bottom. While working, they were therefore secured with ropes from the bank. Again and again were the workers hauled to the surface, wet to the skin, worn out and insensible, while others, who were waiting eagerly for their turn, descended and attacked the obstacle with furious blows, till their nerves and muscles faltered and refused to act from sheer exhaustion. Early next morning a welcome sound reached the ears of the explorers. The men below were working for their own delivery. The rescuers redoubled their efforts, but little impression seemed to be made on the barrier. As the day wore on, even the most hopeful began to ask themselves the question, could the imprisoned men hold out long enough? Not a breath of fresh air could reach them. Ventilation was absolutely stopped. The deadly gas would be slowly but surely accumulating. The third day dawned and found the obstruction still unconquered. During the afternoon, the sounds from below grew fainter and finally ceased. Could they be dead? Was it possible that these lusty limbs were still forever? Surely not. Far more likely was it that they had fallen asleep, overcome with the fatigue of waiting and watching. In such a way did their friends endeavour to keep up their spirits as they cut and hewed and hacked with the energy of desperation. The Queen, with all that loving tenderness and sympathy which she has never ceased to display during her long reign, telegraphed, "The Queen is most anxious to hear that there are hopes of saving the poor souls in the colliery for whom her heart bleeds." Day after day, night after night, the work went on, and it was not till 6 weary, anxious days passed that an opening was made in the obstruction, large enough to allow a man to go through. There was a deep silence on the vast throng of people at the pit mouth, and men could hear their neighbours' hearts beating as William Adams was lowered into the yard seam. The sight that met him in the noxious atmosphere of that long-closed pit was enough to strike the bravest with terror. All around the bottom of the shaft, men were lying as if asleep. Some were quietly resting with their arms thrown back behind their heads, as if they had lain down exhausted by toil. Fathers and sons were lying in each other's embrace, and many a rough fellow was lying with his head pillowed on the breast of a comrade. Spellbound, Adams gazed on the picture, and as the uncertain light of the lamp, falling on one form after another, showed the calm and peaceful expression of untroubled slumber, he thought that after all his friends must be alive and not dead. Vain hope! He took the hand of one man. It was icy cold, and when he released his grasp, it fell to the ground with a dull thud. From one to another he went in the hope of finding at least one sign of life, but even this was denied him. No more would the women of Hartley wait at their doors for the return of these dear ones. Death had come before deliverance. With trembling steps, and almost overcome by the foul gas, Adams crawled back to the shaft, and with great difficulty reached the surface. By the time he was drawn to the bank, he was quite exhausted, and it was not till after restoratives had been applied that he was able to describe the scene he had witnessed. The under-viewer of the mine, named Humble, in company with Hall, an experienced official from a neighbouring colliery, next went down to verify the sad news. It was soon evident to them that the men had been suffocated by carbonic gas, which requires but a few minutes to work with fatal effect. Humble was so much affected by what he saw that, on reaching the surface, he completely broke down and burst into tears. A woman's expression of grief seems only natural to us, painful as the sight is. But when men, and strong men unused to such manifestations of their feelings, give way to weeping, then surely are the depths of misery and anguish fathomed. As Humble cried out in his broad Northumbrian accent, "So many of my fellow creatures, my canny fellows, all killed." There were many eyes dimmed with tears. Almost distracted with grief, he was unable to give any account of the state of affairs to the waiting, agony-stricken crowd. Hall was more composed, and told the people plainly what he had seen. United, they had prayed and watched and waited for the aid that only reached them, alas, too late. "Are they all dead?" asked a poor woman whose husband and 3 sons were in the mine. "Yes," replied Hall, "they are all dead. They died peacefully and without pain, not of hunger, for though the corn bins were empty, many had grain in their pockets." Unspeakably distressing were the scenes that followed, as wives and mothers identified the bodies of their husbands and children. Every cottage in Old and New Hartley resounded with weeping and lamentation, for there was not a house in which there was not one dead. In removing the bodies, many relics were found, which threw a pathetic light on the last moments of the entombed men. In a small memorandum book the following entry was made: "Friday afternoon at 1:30, Edward Armstrong, Thomas Eldon, John Harding, Thomas Bell, and others took extremely ill. We had also a prayer meeting at 1:45, when Tibbs, Henry Sharp, I. Campbell, H. Gibson, and William Palmer prayed. Tibbs exhorted us again, and Sharp also." Lying on the ground near one of the men was a tin box, on which he had roughly scratched the words, "Mercy, O God." Another contained the last message of a husband to his wife, cut short ere it could be finished. It ran: "Friday afternoon. My dear Sarah, I leave you." Of the male population employed at the colliery, only 25 remained alive, and by the accident 103 wives became widows, and 257 children were left fatherless. When the magnitude of the disaster became known in England, it was regarded as a national calamity, and a great wave of sympathy swept over the land. The Lord Mayor of London started a permanent relief fund for the widows and orphans, which in a very short time amounted to £20,000. Still subscriptions continued to flow in, and the total gradually swelled to the magnificent sum of £81,000. Though nothing could ever obliterate the memory of their loved ones from the minds of the sufferers from this dreadful calamity, it is pleasing to know that poverty was not added to the burden they had to bear. That concludes Chapter 6, and is the end of Section 3. Section 4 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7. A series of explosions. No instance is recorded of so fatal a catastrophe in one of our coal mines as that which happened on the 12th of December 1866 at the Oaks Colliery near Barnsley. At 6 o'clock in the morning, nearly 400 men and boys went down the shaft to commence their daily labour. They continued in the workings till shortly after 1 o'clock, when those on the bank were alarmed by the report of an explosion in the pit and a tempestuous rush of air and soot up the shaft. Wild was the excitement in the district, and frantic was the rush of women and children towards the pit. Brave men were there, impatient to go to rescue the living and recover the dead, and in less than an hour a party of 3 went down to examine the mine. On reaching the bottom, their worst fears were almost immediately confirmed. Scattered about in all directions lay the victims of the firedamp, frightfully burned and bruised. Others, who seemed to have survived the explosion, were found with their heads resting on their hands as if asleep. But it was the sleep of death to which they had been lulled by the afterdamp. Others, again, though suffering fearful agonies, were alive and were quickly and tenderly conveyed to the bank. The 3 men returned, faint and sick with the ghastly sight, and several exploring parties, numbering in all about 80 men, were formed to continue the search. After many fruitless journeys, 18 men were found seriously injured, but still living. Stimulated by their discovery, the explorers pressed forward in defiance of the afterdamp, but, as before, the recovery of dead bodies alone rewarded their exertions. Night came on, stormy and bitterly cold. At the pithead fires were lighted, and round them clustered the wives and friends of the unfortunate men. Below, the work of exploration was carried on with undiminished vigour. As each body was brought to the surface, a rush was made by the weary, waiting crowd towards the cage to see if it could be identified. But, alas, the injuries the poor fellows had received made it very difficult, and in some cases impossible, for their friends to recognise them. At midnight it became apparent that there was absolutely no hope of anyone being alive in the mine, and the recovery of the bodies was abandoned till morning. Many touching stories were told that night by the searchers. In one instance, they had come across between 20 and 30 miners locked in each other's arms. From the attitudes of others, it was evident that they had been struck down lifeless when bidding each other a last good-bye. Some there were, too, who, in the midst of their terror, had not forgotten to appeal for mercy to the giver of life. The bent but rigid knees, the uplifted and stiffened arms, told as plainly as words that their last act was one of prayer. That the recovery of the bodies might proceed without interruption on the following day, a young engineer named Parkin Jeffcock descended the shaft and directed his attention to restoring the circulation of fresh air. He spent the whole night exploring the mine. He found that in many places the roadway was partially blocked by masses of rubbish which had been brought down by the explosion. Many dead bodies were also lying about, and in one place nearly 40 were seen in a space of 30 yards, so suddenly had death seized his victims. Uninfluenced by the long night of toil and horror, Jeffcock, with a band of men as gallant as himself, went down the pit shortly after 8 o'clock next morning. They had not been long gone when a reversal of the air current took place. On the bank the greatest excitement prevailed, and the return of the gallant explorers was awaited with painful anxiety. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, a fearful crash was heard, and a shower of rubbish was shot high into the air. A second explosion had taken place. Words fail to convey a picture of the scene which followed. Women ran about hither and thither, filling the air with their shrieks and wailings, and tearing their hair in the agony of their grief. Others fell down fainting, and lay as if dead. And strong men momentarily lost their self-control. All hope was now at an end, and even the melancholy satisfaction of recovering the remains of their husbands and fathers would be denied them. To the disaster of the previous day was added a new calamity, for Parkin Jeffcock and the 28 explorers who had descended full of life and health less than an hour before were numbered with the dead. A chain was, however, lowered to the bottom of the shaft, and a man named Dawson volunteered to descend and report on the state of affairs in the mine. Before he could carry his desperate resolution into effect, there came a third explosion, of greater violence than the previous ones. A large portion of the gearing at the pithead was blown away, the conducting rods were broken, and the heavy iron chain, which had been lowered in the hope of bringing up some of the searchers, was blown on to the top of the ruins of the gearing. All operations were then suspended, and the people who all along had clustered round the pit mouth were removed beyond the reach of danger. Some hours later the shaft took fire, and another explosion was feared. To assist in extinguishing the flames, the fire brigade was sent for from Barnsley, and in a short time the danger was over. About 5 o'clock in the morning of the 15th, the firemen declared that they heard someone in the pit bottom. The excitement which these words produced was painful to a degree. Each one of the waiting multitude pictured a husband or a son restored, and the desolation of her home averted. Some of the miners listened for the sound which the firemen had heard, and, sure enough, from the very bowels of the earth came a faint cry for help. Active steps were at once taken to rescue the survivor. A pulley was erected, and 2 young men volunteered to go down. Slowly and cautiously they were lowered into the very jaws of death, signalling repeatedly to those at the top, till at length the bottom was reached. The descent had occupied a quarter of an hour. To their joy and gratitude, the rescuers found one of the men who had descended to explore the mine after the first explosion. He was almost unconscious and could tell them nothing. They tried to make their way into the mine, but their progress was barred by a blazing wall of coal. They shouted the names of those who had gone down the day before, but there was no reply. Sadly and reluctantly they returned to the surface, bearing the rescued man between them, and the cheers of triumph which greeted their appearance were broken by tears as their comrades thought of those whom they would never see again. The rescued man, whose name was Samuel Brown, was supplied with food suitable to his condition. He had been 20 hours in the mine and had survived 2 explosions. Truly a most remarkable and unexampled escape. His memory was completely gone, and he was utterly unconscious of having been in the pit. After a sound sleep, however, he recovered consciousness and told the story of his adventures. He was knocked down and severely bruised on the head by the force of the explosion, but the fire only slightly touched him. He began to make his way towards the shaft when he was overpowered by the afterdamp. How long he lay unconscious he was unable to say, but immediately on regaining his senses, he again tried to reach the shaft. He wandered about for some time without knowing which way he went. In the workings he stumbled over many prostrate forms, all of which were those of dead men. When Brown was asked how he knew they were dead, he replied that he had knelt down beside the greater number of them and listened for indications of life, but he heard neither breathing nor heart-throb. In some places there were as many as 40 men lying together. Some of them had succumbed to afterdamp, others were fearfully disfigured and had the appearance of having been roasted to a cinder. He also gave it as his opinion that there was not a single soul alive in the mine. Several other explosions took place in rapid succession. One of these was followed by large escapes of gas which smelled strongly of sulphur. The report was accompanied by a hissing noise and a dull roaring sound, like that of a railway train in the distance. A policeman on duty about 40 yards from the pit mouth was blown off his feet by the concussion, while at the same time an enormous quantity of soot, bricks and small coal was hurled into the air. The smell of chokedamp was strongly felt on the bank for long afterwards, and everything was covered with a thick coating of black dust. The repeated occurrence of these explosions, unmistakable evidences of fire and gas coming in contact within the mine, determined the authorities to close up the shaft as the only means of extinguishing the fire, a task which was only accomplished after long and perilous labour. The total loss of life by this explosion was estimated at 358, and the appalling severity of the catastrophe happily still stands unrivalled. The heroism of the exploring parties is the only gleam of brightness which penetrates the pall of gloom, and the greatness of their bravery and sacrifice appeals to all that is best and deepest in human sympathy. That concludes Chapter 7. The section continues with Chapter 8. Buried Alive. In the heroic story of coal mining, there is no more unique romance than that of the Tynewith pit in the Rhondda Valley, Glamorganshire. On the 11th of April 1877, just as the day's work was over and the men were making their way towards the shaft, they were terrified by a rush of water so strong and foam-crested that the miners thought the sea had broken in on them. Many forced their way through the rising flood to the shaft and were raised to the surface in safety. But when the muster roll was called, it was found that 14 men and boys were missing. An exploring party immediately descended and found that, though the shaft was clear, all the workings were full of water. It was therefore concluded that all the 14 were drowned. Hark! What was that? The explorers listened. and from behind a mass of coal about 30 feet thick came a faint sound of knocking, and commenced to cut through the solid mass. The imprisoned miners had taken refuge in what is known as the rise, and the air being driven in before them by the rush of water, they found themselves, though hemmed in, yet in comparative safety. Fortunately, they had their picks with them, and when they heard their deliverers at work, they determined to assist in their own deliverance and drove to meet them. On each side of the mass, relays of men worked with tremendous energy, and in one night 8 yards of coal were cut through. On Thursday morning, the day after the disaster, only a thin barrier remained between the imprisoned men and freedom. Then one of the colliers, eager to escape, attempted to break through with a chisel. He had partly succeeded when the compressed air exploded with a terrific report, and the unfortunate man was dashed against the opening. Death was instantaneous. With the greatest difficulty, his body was drawn through the hole, and then the remainder, 4 in number, were rescued and taken in safety to the bank. When they had sufficiently recovered from their exhaustion, they told how, after their race for life with the torrent foaming at their feet, they rushed into the rise. Then, finding themselves on dry ground, for the pressure of air kept the water from rising, they knelt down by a common impulse and prayed, and sang a favourite Welsh hymn, of which the following is a translation. In the deep and mighty waters, no one there can hold my head, but my only Saviour Jesus, he who suffered in my stead. Friend he is in Jordan's river, holds above the wave my head. With his smile I'll go rejoicing through the region of the dead. 9 men were, however, still missing, and the anxious search was renewed. While some were exploring the mine, others rigged up additional pumps in the hope of reducing the water. No sign or sound of the entombed men rewarded these efforts till Friday afternoon, when knocking was heard from Thomas Morgan's stall. The sound is described, by one who heard it, as thrilling in the extreme, coming, as it did, like a message from the grave. An exact knowledge of the mine showed that there was tremendous difficulties in the way of a rescue. On one side, 38 yards of soil coal intervened, and on the other, access was cut off by an immense body of water, a veritable underground ocean. To cut through the one, or to drain off the other in time to save life, appeared equally impossible. The pumping operations had failed to make any impression on the flood, and it was therefore decided to obtain the aid of experienced divers. On Saturday, 2, named Frank Davis and Thomas Purvis, arrived from London and descended the workings. The peril was great, and those on the bank waited the result of the venture with intense anxiety. A man stood at the pit mouth with a line in his hand to record their progress. Slowly they advanced into the mine for a distance of 500 feet, and within 250 feet of the stall. Everyone confidently anticipated the recovery of the men, when the signal was given that the divers were coming back. they had been unable to proceed farther on account of the wreckage floating about. Nothing now remained but to set all the pumps to work and to cut through the coal. Shifts were arranged, and all the best miners in the neighbourhood offered their services. 4 men worked in each shift, and they were relieved every 3 or 4 hours. On Monday morning, 5 days after the disaster, the cutting commenced. The spectacle of the first attack on the coal tomb was in the highest degree exciting. The place sloped downwards about 4 inches per yard, and every piece of coal had to be again pulled up and placed on one side. The colliers plied their picks as they had never plied them before. They rained blow after blow unremittingly. No halt, no looking back, no word. Fiercely, almost savagely, the men worked, and, when the shift of 3 hours had passed, fell back exhausted, only for fresh men to take their places, and show that the same grand stimulus inspired them, prompting to the same desperate hardihood and determination. Day and night the work continued. Colliers, colliery owners and mining agents worked together, setting aside for the time being all social distinctions. No voice of authority was heard issuing orders. Each man did the work that came ready to his hand. On Wednesday only 6 yards of coal remained to be cut, and the voices of the imprisoned men could be distinctly heard. A boring apparatus was then brought to work, and an attempt was made to communicate with the unfortunate men and give them food, but in vain. The moment an opening was effected, the pent-up air rushed through the hole with a noise like that of a blast furnace, and it was with the utmost difficulty that the opening could be plugged up. On Thursday, a new and more terrible danger was discovered. Suddenly a large discharge of gas came upon them, and the flames were actually bursting forth from the gauze of the lamps before the gallant rescuers turned and fled to a place of safety. Their retreat was but momentary. An engineer named William Brith grasped the situation, and at the most critical moment, when it seemed as if the rescue would have to be abandoned, he shouted out, "Here, I volunteer. Shut the doors on me, and I'll cut a passage through." His example was not lost on his companions. "I'll go for another," and I, was shouted from all sides. Back went the intrepid little band, falling over one another in the darkness and in their eagerness to make up for lost time. Speedily arrangements were made to carry off the gas, and the work went on as before. To fully appreciate the daring of these men, we must not lose sight of the circumstances under which they laboured. The passage was in many places barely 3 feet high, and as they struggled on in the close and gas-laden atmosphere, they were menaced by no ordinary dangers. An explosion might happen at any moment, and every inch they advanced increased the peril, not only to themselves, but also to those they were striving to rescue. They had already been witnesses of the destructive power of compressed air, and they also knew that as soon as the air was allowed to escape, the water would rise, and if the men could not be speedily released, they would certainly be drowned. Indeed, these fears were almost realised, for on Thursday, when it became necessary to allow the pent-up air to escape, the imprisoned men cried out in terror, "The water is coming up fast! We shall drown!" The holes were again closed, and the rescuers resumed their work, this time in perfect darkness, lest their lights should cause an explosion. At length, on Friday afternoon, the barrier was broken through. The man whose pick first entered the breach was hurled back with great violence. The excitement was terrible. The compressed air escaped in gusts, each of which caused a deafening explosion. Then one of the rescuers, named Abraham Todd, jumped through the opening. What followed will be best described in his own words. "Where are you?" I shouted. Then George Jenkins came to me and caught hold of me, and then I felt his arms round my neck and he kissed me repeatedly. Moses Powell did the same. I asked where the other men were, and they replied, "Behind." I then went to where John Thomas was sitting on a lump of coal with his head hanging down, apparently lifeless. I said to him, "John, don't you know me?" And he said, "Yes." And that was all I heard them speak. There were 4 men and a boy. Meanwhile, the whole of England had for days anxiously waited for news of the Tynewith disaster, and the work of the daring rescuers was followed with great interest. Telegrams from the Queen, from the Home Secretary, from the Lord Mayor of London were constantly arriving with inquiries about the buried men. Shortly after the breach had been made, another telegram came from the Queen saying, "Very anxious for the last accounts of the poor men in the mine. Are they saved? Pray telegraph." On a hill behind the colliery, from which a good view of the pit could be obtained, a vast mass of people had gathered and watched every movement with interest. They had seen several medical men go down the shaft, and they naturally concluded that the imprisoned men had been rescued. Presently there was a stir at the pit's mouth, and one of the managers ran forward to a spot where he could be seen by every one of the thousands on the hillside, and impressively waved his hand downwards. The signal was understood, and cheers, only too ready to burst forth, were suppressed. One after another the men were brought up to the bank. First came the small huddled-up form of the boy, David Hughes, so shrunken and emaciated that the lips of even strong men quivered, and their eyes filled with tears. Then followed John Thomas, David Jenkins, George Jenkins, and Moses Powell. Tenderly they were carried into an improvised hospital near, where they received every attention. Great were the rejoicings, not only in the district, but throughout the whole of England. Yet they were not unmixed with sadness, for there were still 4 men missing. They, poor fellows, would never be heard of again. They had been overwhelmed by the flood and drowned. Thrilling was the story of their imprisonment, which the rescued men had to tell. The flood had come upon them so suddenly that they were barely able to reach a place of safety. The boy Hughes would have been swept away by the torrent but for the help of George Jenkins, who kept hold of him till they were out of danger. They described the water as coming in great waves and surging in on them like a rough sea dashing upon a stony beach. Having only their thin working clothes on, they suffered very much from cold. They found a tram full of coal in the stall, and after emptying out the contents, they went into it and lay huddled together so as to gain warmth. As time went on, one of the men showed symptoms of insanity and could with difficulty be prevented from throwing himself into the water. The boy Hughes, too, was an additional source of anxiety. Now and again he cried. At other times he sang hymns. Jenkins nursed him nearly all the time and animated his companions to hope on, for deliverance was sure to come. Powell and Jenkins at different times attempted to make their way through the water, but they had to return. It was like the sea, everywhere. They did not sleep much, only dozing off from time to time for a few minutes, and during the 10 long days of their imprisonment they had nothing to eat but the drippings of the candle boxes, and no drink but dirty water. It is difficult to decide whether the patience displayed by the entombed men, or the resolute daring of their rescuers, is more worthy of admiration. Mr. Wales, the Inspector of Mines, says, "During my experience as a colliery manager and government inspector, extending together over a period of 25 years, I have witnessed many acts of daring and bravery. But on no occasion have I seen greater bravery, courage and discretion than were displayed in the efforts to rescue these 5 men. The Queen, who, as we have seen, took a deep interest in the disaster, was so impressed with the bravery of these Welsh rescuers that she conferred upon them the Albert Medal, a decoration which previously had been reserved for those who saved life at sea. Nearly 50,000 persons witnessed the ceremony. The story of the Rhondda colliers is one of those episodes of British valour which show what men can dare and do, what is the capacity for suffering, short of death in one case, what the height to which unselfish devotion can rise in the other. And as such it can never die, but will be handed down from generation to generation, a priceless heirloom. 10 days far down these 5 drew painful breath, and heard at last the strokes that hewed a way through the black wall, a race 'twixt strength and death, hunger and water waiting for their prey. 10 days above that valley poured its life, men, women, children round that sodden grave, to watch with heartsick hope the stubborn strife betwixt men's power to bear, men's power to save. 10 days, wide England through, the nation's heart hung on the struggle with one pulse, one breath, answering the wires which told the yards that part the savers from the sufferers, life from death. Great strife in little space was theirs to wage, that black wall their least foe, with poisonous flame, pent air let loose, and prisoned waters rage, still rising as salvation nearer came. One side that wall, the life that ebbed away, as inch by inch the cruel waters crept. The other side, strong arms the pick that sway in face of many deaths, till forth there leapt the shout of victory, for life and strength had been too much for death. The 5 were one, from famine, water, fire, and clasped at length their saviour's helping hands, the fight was done. And England's heart, in common sympathy, uttered itself in burst of thankful prayer. From throne and cottage rose one happy cry, "Well done!" as if all England gathered there. That concludes Chapter 8, and is the end of Section 4. Section 5 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9. The Hero of Usworth. In the story of colliery adventure, it is not often that one man can be singled out from his companions as specially worthy of praise. All work so hard and dare so much to effect the rescue or recover the bodies of their comrades, that to select one of the number would be often unjust. How daring, therefore, must be the deed which entitles one of such a noble band to be regarded as the hero. Such an one was Clarence Lindsay, the underviewer of the Usworth colliery near Gateshead. On the 2nd of March 1885, the men on the night shift were standing round the mouth of the shaft, waiting till it was time for them to go to work. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, the cage came up and several men took their places. Suddenly a crashing report was heard from below, and an uprush of air and dust told the oft-repeated tale of an explosion. The partition which divided the shaft into two sections was shattered, and the cage was smashed to atoms. The miners who were preparing to descend fled in all directions and saved their lives. But had the explosion occurred 2 minutes later, the whole night shift, consisting of 120 men, would have been hurled into eternity. Realising their miraculous escape, they were for some time dazed with horror and utterly incapable of action. The alarm quickly spread, and from every quarter crowds of people came flocking to the pit, eager to learn the nature and cause of the accident. From the neighbouring collieries, men in flannel suits, knee breeches, and leather caps hurried forward to offer their services in exploring the mine. The main shaft led to 3 seams of coal, named the Magdalen, the Low Main, and the Hatton. The Magdalen was reached after a descent of 157 fathoms. The Hatton, the deepest of the 3, was 172 fathoms below the surface. The explosion had taken place in the west pit of the Magdalen seam, and had completely wrecked the shaft, so that all access to the mine was impossible by the ordinary means. Fortunately, the back shaft, which was used for ventilating purposes, remained intact, and as soon as the men on the bank recovered from their shock, they made ready to descend. A chain and kibble, a small iron cauldron, was suspended over the back shaft from a windlass, and a band of explorers came forward to hazard their lives. On reaching the bottom, they saw a sight which was calculated to destroy all hope. Wherever the eye turned, it fell on masses of wreckage and confusion beyond description. Boarding, props, machinery, coal, stone, and tools lay scattered about in great piles. Cautiously the explorers piloted their way towards the West Pit. They had not gone far when they came upon a dead body, scorched, bruised and disfigured in a shocking manner. Near at hand lay 3 men, all of whom were alive. Tenderly they were conveyed to the surface and put into the hands of the doctors. Others were afterwards rescued, suffering from burns and scalds as if from a boiler explosion. Heavy falls of the roof and sides rendered the work of the exploring party arduous in the extreme. For some time they struggled on, crawling through holes in the mass of rubbish on their hands and knees. At length the universal wreckage compelled them to return, with the mournful news that there was absolutely no hope of rescuing any more alive. Day after day, parties of explorers went down to bring back the bodies of their comrades, but little success attended their efforts. The obstacles were found to be insurmountable, and all attempts to cut a way through them were frustrated by the soft material of which the masses were composed, falling from the roof and sides as fast as it was taken out. Upwards of 40 miners lost their lives by this explosion. The deed, which won for Clarence Lindsay a place on the roll of fame, was performed shortly after the disaster had happened. He was among the first party of explorers who descended the mine. On finding that the main way into the West Pit, where the unfortunate miners were entombed, was hopelessly blocked, he resolved to make an expedition into the return airways, for the double purpose of discovering if any of the men had found their way thither, and of ascertaining if the passages could be relied on to maintain the ventilation. Accompanied by Elijah Donnelly, he went into the return of the East Pit. On the way he met Richard Slee, who, on hearing their errand, gladly volunteered to accompany them. They travelled along the returns for about 1,000 yards, and found that everything was in good working order, but no trace of the missing miners could be discovered. Satisfied that they could do no more, they retraced their steps, Lindsay leading the way. In a short time he discovered that his companions had fallen to the rear. He looked round to see what had become of them, when Slee called his attention to Donnelly. It was evident that the poor fellow had inhaled afterdamp, for his walk had become unsteady, and he complained of numbness in the limbs. They had experienced nothing of the kind on the outward journey, but now that they were facing the opposite direction, they were exposed to the attacks of the deadly vapour. No time was to be lost. Lindsay seized Donnelly by one arm and Slee took the other, and between them they hurried him along in the hope that purer air would revive him. The poor fellow staggered along for some time, but gradually became more and more helpless. Slee was also attacked, and suddenly let fall his comrade's arm and walked on some distance in front, utterly unconscious of what he had done. Lindsay continued to struggle with Donnelly, now utterly incapable of helping himself, and dragged him about 30 yards farther on. Then, turning to Slee, he said, "What's to be done now?" Slee replied in a half-sleepy fashion, "Oh, he's gone," as if to imply that there was no need to struggle farther. Lindsay, however, determined to make another attempt. Seizing Donnelly by one arm, he ordered Slee to take hold of the other. He stooped to obey, but nature was now exhausted and could no longer withstand the onset of the insidious chokedamp. In the very act of taking hold of his dying comrade, Slee fell helpless to the ground. The position in which Lindsay found himself might have unnerved the strongest man. 600 yards had to be travelled before assistance could be reached, and he was uncertain whether to drag his companions along with him or to leave them and go for help. Unwilling while his strength lasted to acknowledge himself beaten, he attempted to drag them out, but he had not gone 10 yards before he reeled and fell, overcome by giddiness. In his fall, his lamp went under him and was extinguished. Even in this extremity, the perplexing question haunted him. Should he leave his companions? Gradually a feeling of repose came over him, warning him what his fate would be if he remained longer in the poisonous atmosphere. With an effort he recalled his wandering faculties and started to make his way to the shaft. He staggered along, becoming more and more powerless at every step. Then he crept along on his hands and knees. 3 times he lost his way, and as often did he return and make a fresh start. His condition was truly awful, and he foamed at the mouth. Fortunately, he was found at last by an exploring party and carried to the bottom of the shaft, where he was attended by Dr. Wilson, the colliery doctor. Here, when he had sufficiently recovered, he told the painful story of how Donnelly and Slee had been overcome by the fatal gas, and urged that no time should be lost in recovering them, alive or dead. His wishes were obeyed, and, after a search of some hours, the lifeless bodies of the 2 unfortunate men were brought to the surface. Nothing could be nobler than the efforts which Lindsay made to save life on that eventful day, and it is to be regretted that his endeavours, so prompt and persevering, should have resulted in pain to himself and bereavement to others. For some time his life was despaired of, but, thanks to the constant and skilful attention of Dr. Wilson, he recovered, and in a few days he was none the worse for his thrilling adventure. 3 years later, Lindsay was appointed Chief Engineer of the diamond mines at Kimberley, South Africa. The De Beers district, as it is called, is the largest commercial undertaking in Cape Colony, and consists of 4 mines, which are worked by a company. Thousands of men are employed, and the workings practically furnish the world's supply of diamonds. Lindsay had only been in his new position about a fortnight, when a fire occurred at the entrance of the shaft of the De Beers mine. It was, at the time, about 11 acres in extent, and had been worked downward in the form of a great pit. The fire spread with alarming rapidity, and it soon became evident that the lives of 800 men were in dire peril. After many valiant attempts had failed to get at the entombed men, an entrance was effected by a long disused tunnel. All day long the rescuers toiled with a will, and when the sun set, upwards of 400 natives had been recovered alive, and 43 white men. 24 whites and nearly 200 natives were given up as dead. Among those who perished was Clarence Lindsay. When he saw the first indications of danger, he ordered one of the men who was about to descend to retire, while he took his place to meet his doom, for he was never again seen. True to his heroic nature, he died at the post of duty. That concludes Chapter 9. The section continues with Chapter 10. Victims of Carelessness. The constant and terrible peril which surrounds the miner received another illustration in an explosion which took place on the 18th of June 1885 at the Clifton Hall pit at Pendlebury near Manchester. The mine had previously been regarded as very safe and was so free from dangerous gases that in some parts it was customary for the men to work with naked lights. The main shaft, 540 yards deep, gave access to 3 different seams of coal. The first was known as the Doe. Some distance farther down was the 5 quarters, while the lowest and most productive was known as the trencher bone. From the Doe and the 5 quarters there was a tunnel, nearly a mile in length, by which communication might be made with the Agecroft colliery adjoining. Shortly after 5 o'clock on Thursday morning, 340 men and boys descended the Clifton Hall shaft and were soon scattered over the widely extending area of the workings. All went well till about 9:30, when the miners had stopped work for breakfast. Then those at the mouth of the pit were startled by seeing a sheet of flame and a cloud of dust and smoke shoot up the shaft, followed immediately by a loud explosion. The force of the blast tore some of the surface plates from their places and hurled part of the ironwork of the cages up the shaft and on to the pulleys overhead, smashing the woodwork almost to fragments. The report of the explosion was distinctly heard in all the colliery villages in the district, and its meaning was only too well understood. From every street, indeed from every house, the people rushed and hurried along in the direction of Clifton Hall shaft. Round the mouth of the pit they gathered in large crowds, taking possession of every spot from which a full view of the operations might be obtained. The large banks of coal and heaps of coal dust, with which every visitor to a pit is familiar, were covered by the eager and excited throng. They swarmed in the fields adjoining the colliery, and even the roads were thronged with people and vehicles hurrying to and from the scene of the explosion. As soon as the smoke had cleared away, measures were taken for effecting a descent, but it was found that the 2 cages, which must have been passing each other when the explosion occurred, had become fixed in the centre of the shaft. All efforts made by the engine to disengage them were unavailing. The manager of the colliery, Jonathan Hall, accompanied by 2 men, managed to make their way down to the cages, and after some time succeeded in freeing them so that they could travel up and down with ease. Then 3 men descended to the bottom of the pit. There a most melancholy sight was presented to them, and one which confirmed their worst fears. Within a few yards of each other lay the bodies of about 50 men and boys. Some were dead, Others were alive, though fearfully injured, and all were blackened and scorched almost beyond recognition. The furnaces, by means of which the artificial ventilation of the pit was conducted, were extinguished. Beyond this, the force of the explosion had in many places torn the supports from their places and caused heavy falls from the roof, which blocked the roadway in all directions. The men therefore returned to the surface and reported what they had seen. The work of systematic exploration was thereupon organised. 7 parties were formed and proceeded below. The danger of this self-imposed task was terrible to contemplate, and it was feared that the brave fellows would soon share the fate of their comrades below. A brief examination was sufficient to convince the explorers of the hopelessness of their task, for they found that they could not penetrate more than 100 yards along any of the workings. Still they persevered with that unselfish courage which an event of this kind never fails to bring to light, and about 11 o'clock the first of the imprisoned men were released and made their way to the surface by the Agecroft shaft. All of these had been working in the 2 upper seams, and from their stories it was learned that the explosion had taken place in the Trencherbone mine. For some time after this, only slow progress was made, and just when despair was beginning to assert itself, the explorers came upon a large number of their companions, most of whom were alive, and on being drawn to the surface were at once taken to their homes. By noon, 116 men and boys had been rescued. At 2 o'clock it was deemed expedient to stop work in this part of the mine. 6 more men had been taken out alive and 9 bodies had been brought to the surface. Many of those who were fortunate enough to escape without mortal injury were sick and faint with their long exposure to the chokedamp, and others had received wounds of a more or less serious nature. Of those who had lost their lives, the majority seemed to have perished by drowning, and others had evidently been suffocated by the foul gas which followed the explosion. During the afternoon, another attempt at rescue was resolved on, and 30 explorers descended. Almost immediately after they reached the bottom, it was noticed by the watchers at the pit mouth that the ventilation had been suddenly reversed, a sure indication of another explosion or of a fall of roof. Signals were at once made to the searching party to warn them of their danger, but met with no response. 4 miners therefore gallantly volunteered to go and see what was the matter. Cautiously, the cage was lowered to the bottom. In a few minutes the men returned and said that they had been unable to advance more than a few hundred yards before they were stopped by an immense volume of gas, and it was almost certain that the exploring party had met the fate of those they had descended to save. The gloom which the news occasioned on the bank was soon afterwards happily dispersed by the appearance of the men themselves. They had had a very narrow escape. When only a short distance from the bottom of the shaft, they observed that the ventilation had ceased, and therefore decided that it was impossible for them to return by the way they had come. They, therefore, hurried along the workings to the Agecroft pit, where they were all brought to the surface uninjured. All energies were now turned to restoring the interrupted ventilation, and it was late at night before it was sufficiently finished to allow further exploration. The first party that went down to the deep seam were astonished and delighted to find 14 men and boys still living. They had been working at the extreme end of one of the side levels and had escaped by constructing a rough partition to arrest the advance of the afterdamp. They were very much exhausted, but with careful attention and treatment rapidly regained their strength. 2 days after the disaster, access was obtained to all parts of the pit, and a large number of bodies were sent to the surface. Great difficulty was experienced by the relatives of the men in identifying them, for in many cases they were too much mutilated to be recognised by their faces and general appearance, and the uncertain method of claiming the bodies by a knowledge of the clothing worn by the deceased on the day of the accident had to be resorted to. The total number of lives lost amounted to 180. To relieve the distress of the 85 widows and 289 children who were rendered destitute by the catastrophe, a fund was set on foot in Manchester, which in one day amounted to nearly £1,000. With regard to the cause of the explosion, it was stated that naked lights were used, and one of the survivors, taken from the trencher-bone seam, admitted that he and his companions were in the regular habit of smoking after breakfast. The well-known safe character of the mine and its long immunity from accident doubtless led the miners to believe that they were perfectly safe. But we cannot help regretting the fact that so much misery and suffering and death were brought about by a neglect of one of the most obvious precautions the collier is called upon to observe. That concludes Chapter 10, and is the end of Section 5. Section 6 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11. An Accumulation of Horrors. About 3:15 on Saturday afternoon, the 23rd of June, 1894, the inhabitants of Kelvined, near Pontypridd, were startled by a loud report, followed by a tremendous concussion which seemed to shake the earth to its very foundations. Hundreds of persons at once rushed to their doors, and as the houses are built on the slopes of the mountainside, the inhabitants commanded a full view of the valley. The sight that met their gaze told its own terrible story. The force of the concussion had completely blown the top of the Albion pit to pieces, and large beams were hurled about in all directions. The mouth of the mine was enveloped in thick smoke, through which tongues of flame shot high into the air. At once a rush was made towards the colliery, and before the officials had time to consider what should be done, they found themselves surrounded by a crowd of weeping women and children, eager to know the results of the explosion, and by colliers gallantly offering to form a rescue party to descend the pit. The mine is one of the largest in South Wales, the depth of the shaft being about 1,600 feet. Nearly 2,000 men were usually employed underground, but fortunately at the time of the explosion, only about a sixth of that number were below. These were known as the afternoon repairing shift, and had been at work for little over an hour. For a long time, dense clouds of smoke continued to be thrown up from the shaft, and made it impossible to begin the work of exploration. When at length the smoke cleared away, a rescue party was formed under Philip Jones, the manager of the colliery. Before they could descend, however, the damage done to the cage by the explosion had to be repaired, and then they were lowered into the mine. This was necessarily slow work at first. Not only did the smoke hinder them, but it was not known what damage might have been done to the shaft, or whether it remained clear to the bottom. After great perseverance, the foot of the shaft was reached, and the gallant explorers set out on their perilous quest. There were now thousands gathered all round the bank, and every moment added to the number. For as the news spread from village to village, men, women and children hastened to the spot, many of them coming for miles over the mountains. It was not until nearly 2 hours had passed that the cage again made its appearance, with only one occupant. More volunteers were called for, and in a few minutes the cage returned with a band of explorers. Another hour was spent by those on the bank in an agony of suspense. Then word was received that many dead bodies had been found, but very few survivors. Shortly afterwards, 16 poor fellows were sent to the surface more dead than alive, and were carefully tended by the doctors who were in waiting. Every time a man was brought up, a rush was made by the crowd to the cage, and many heartrending scenes took place as wives, mothers and sisters recognised in the burned and scalded figures on the stretchers those who had left them strong and well only a few hours before. Of the 16 thus rescued, 7 afterwards died from their injuries. The work of exploring the workings was continued all night, and by 8 o'clock on Sunday morning 86 bodies had been recovered. About an hour later, it became known that there was no further hope of rescuing any alive. The scene which ensued among the waiting crowd was one which is seldom seen except at disasters of this kind, and beggars description. The wails of anguish, the wringing of the hands, the stony expression of the faces, told of a grief too deep for tears. The recovery of the bodies was rendered extremely difficult by the extensive falls of earth which the explosion had caused, and which, in some cases, had completely buried parties of men and crushed their bodies beyond recognition. The courage of the explorers deserves the highest praise. Day after day they toiled on steadily, although the sights they met with were more than enough to unnerve the strongest. And on Thursday a dreadful total of 260 dead bodies had been sent to the surface. The explorers had some pitiful tales to tell. In consequence of falls and afterdamp, they were unable to answer many calls for help, and they had repeatedly been obliged to fly for their lives. The condition of the bodies indicated that the explosion had been of a terrific character, but they were unable to say what caused it. Some of the scenes witnessed below, they described as simply appalling, and they spoke of them with feelings of pain. In one place, 5 bodies were lying heaped together. Each man seemed to have made a hard fight for life. One poor fellow was found who had actually wetted his cap with tea from his tin and placed it to his lips in the hope of overcoming the poisonous fumes of the chokedamp. A little farther on lay 2 men, but their bodies could not be reached till a fresh current of air had been sent through the workings. Some were stark naked, their clothes having been violently torn off by the blast. It is sad to relate that several victims were so injured that identification was impossible. Perhaps the most melancholy feature of the disaster was the recovery of the bodies of 24 men heaped together in a position which seemed to indicate that they had attempted to save their lives by running towards the bottom of the shaft, and had been overtaken by the chokedamp. If they had only remained in their working place, situated as it was between 2 doors, the probability is that they would have survived. A Member of Parliament who visited the mine says that the character of the disaster baffled description, and the accumulation of horrors surpassed his experience, and was too pathetic for words. The destruction of life in some cases amounted to the extinction of whole families. In one house, for example, lay the body of a father and his 4 sons. The funerals of the victims occupied 3 days. During that mournful period, all work was suspended, and all who could came to pay their last tribute of respect to their fellow workers. Thousands of people attended, and one of the processions was over 2 miles in length. Occasionally a well-known Welsh hymn was sung, with that peculiarly thrilling effect so noticeable on such occasions. For hours the work of burying was carried on, and as each band of mourners dispersed, the place was taken by another coffin. Thus ended one of the most dreadful disasters ever known throughout the South Wales coalfield. That concludes Chapter 11. The section continues with Chapter 12. The Audley Disaster. One of the most heartrending disasters of recent years happened on Monday the 14th of January 1895 at the Diglake Colliery near Audley, North Staffordshire. Shortly after 12 o'clock, the man at the engines at Boyle's Hall shaft received a signal from below to draw up the cage. He instantly obeyed the summons, and then it was seen that there was something wrong, for the occupants of the cage were drenched with water. They said in reply to their anxious questioners that a flood of water had burst into the mine from the old Diglake workings, and that the men who were below were in imminent danger. The village of Audley contains a purely mining population, and when the news of the accident spread, the utmost excitement prevailed. Crowds of women and children hurried from all directions to the pit mouth to learn the actual state of affairs. It was soon discovered that no descent could be made by the Diglake shaft, and without loss of time rescue parties were organised and lowered into the workings by Boyle's Hall shaft. Those who had succeeded in making their way to this point, which was away from the inflowing water, were speedily brought to the bank. All afternoon the engines were kept busy, and by 5 o'clock 150 men had been rescued. It was then estimated that there were still about 90 men and boys in the pit, and these were supposed to be in such a position that their retreat was completely cut off by the water, while many were in the lower workings, from which there were but few chances of escape. Meanwhile, the rescuers, about 40 in number, were unremitting in their efforts. Foremost among the gallant band was William Dodd, the under-manager. Immediately on receipt of the news of the disaster, he hurried into the workings and told all he met to make their way to Boyle's Hall shaft. Dropping through a trapdoor, he found himself up to the armpits in water in the main dip. Here the force of the current was so great that he was swept downwards like a straw for 20 yards, and had it not been for a post against which he was thrown, nothing could have saved him from being drowned. Cautiously he made his way through the stream in the dark, but gradually the water deepened and he was forced to turn back. Accompanied by another miner, he made his way to the air shaft, down which the water was pouring in a roaring torrent. Being by this time almost exhausted, he sat down for a moment to consider his next course. The water had gone down a little, so he set off to the main dip, but it was as deep as before. Hearing voices at the top of the air shaft, he made his way up the ladders, although the water was pouring down on him all the time. As he neared the top, however, he became unconscious through fatigue, and would have fallen had not one of the men seized hold of him. In spite of his exhaustion, this hero of the mine made another effort, and a successful one, to save life. Having obtained a light, he went again into the workings. In a few minutes men's voices were heard, and he shouted, "Where are you, lads?" The poor fellows recognised the voice of the under-manager, and replied, "We are here, William, and we are glad to see you." He told them to follow his light. Making their way upstream, they reached the staple pit in safety, which they ascended, and were eventually drawn to the surface. Another man who performed yeoman service was John Bolton. He made a heroic attempt to penetrate the flooded workings by swimming, but after proceeding some distance, his head came in contact with the roof, and he was forced to return. At the risk of his life, he then made his way through the deep water at the lower end of the pit, and succeeded in rescuing 5 boys who had taken refuge on an engine. The labour in rescuing these lads was very great, for he had to carry them on his shoulders one after another. Altogether, this brave fellow saved nearly 30 lives on that terrible afternoon. Many miraculous escapes and deeds of daring are recorded. A youth named Sporston, who was working near his father and brother, was carried along by the force of the water for several hundred yards, and thrown into the arms of a man who, at great personal risk, helped him to a place of safety, and afterwards to the surface. This lad was the only survivor of a party of 26. A miner named William Mayer, who was in the pit with about 100 men and boys near the spot where the water first made its appearance, said, "I knew very well what had happened, and we made the best of our way to the shaft. I do not know how long it took us, for the distance was many hundreds of yards, and we had to pick out the highest ways to escape the rising water that roared past us. Mayer added that 11 men and boys were left behind, and that those who escaped ran considerable danger in stopping to help one another. The boys, who cried piteously, especially needed aid, and Mayer and his companions carried them through the workings. One lad was saved while being whirled along by the torrent, with only his hair above water. This plucky collier afterwards descended at the head of a party to rescue the 11 men who had remained behind. They spent nearly 2 hours in the search, but found no trace of them. For the sake of the wives, Mayer put the best face on matters that he could, and said he believed the men had gone to some higher level nearer the village, and would soon be got out. But his looks belied his words, and as he turned aside to draw his hand across his eyes, a bystander was heard to remark, "Ah, poor chap, he has got a son among the 11 below." Another miner named Joseph Bateman, who was fortunate enough to make his escape before the waters reached him, at once offered his services to rescue his comrades. He was accordingly sent to render assistance to any who might be trying to escape by the air shaft. He remained at his post for some time, and helped 60 of his comrades up the ladder. This was by no means an easy task, for the water was pouring down the shaft in a blinding torrent. It was only by feeling the ladder with hands and feet that the men were able to escape, and many of them bore traces of their desperate struggle for life. One touching incident calls for mention. An old collier, one of the veterans of the mine, having exhausted his strength, sank down in despair to await death. His companion, a younger and more vigorous man, refused to leave him, and at the risk of his own life, half pushed, half dragged him to a place of safety. Another aged miner was less fortunate. He was seen struggling in the water, which reached nearly to his chin, and was heard to exclaim that he could go no farther. No help could be rendered, and he was swept away to death in the darkness. During Monday night, the pumps were kept constantly at work, and hour after hour exploring parties went down, but no more of the miners were brought to the surface, and the water was only slowly subsiding. In the village, usually shrouded in darkness long before midnight, lights were seen in nearly every house. At the pithead, anxious wives and relatives stood patiently waiting for tidings of their husbands and friends. Showers of rain, sleet and snow added to the misery of the watchers, but few ceased their vigil. Several of the wives had brought bundles of dry clothes for those whom they fondly hoped would ere long be rescued. One poor woman, who as soon as she heard of the accident rushed to the pit mouth with dry clothing for her man, refused to leave her post all night, lest he should be brought up while she was away and have to walk home in his wet clothes. Another woman had 2 brothers below, and another 2 sons, and these are but samples of the sad stories told by the weary watchers. Day dawned at length, but the depression and gloom were unrelieved by any tidings of the entombed men. From all the surrounding collieries, miners flocked in to help in the work of rescue, which went on throughout the day without result. About 10 o'clock at night, a fresh party descended to remove some wagons which had become wedged together and blocked the passage. The cage had only been at the bottom a few minutes when a hurried signal was given to pull up. When the bank was reached, the lifeless and ghastly form of the first discovered victim of the disaster was placed on a stretcher and carried to one of the outbuildings to await identification. The poor fellow's body was found near the bottom of the shaft, firmly wedged among the wagons and a heap of debris. It was seen that he had turned up one leg of his trousers as though preparing to wade through the water, but, finding the alarming nature of the flood, he seems to have hurried towards the shaft without waiting to turn up the other trouser leg. His haste, alas, availed him nothing. A few hours later, another body was found, and, after considerable labour, brought to the surface. It proved to be that of Henry Rhodes, a boy of 16 years of age. The anguish which these discoveries caused among the crowd on the bank was exceedingly painful to witness. The doom of the imprisoned men seemed sealed. Through the night and during the following day, hope and fear alternated as the water rose and fell in the workings. Gradually, however, it became apparent to everyone that there was absolutely no chance of saving life. Enormous masses of debris blocked the advance of the exploring parties, completely filling up the roadway from side to side and from floor to roof. Bravely the work was carried on, but progress was extremely slow and rendered apparently more so by the fact that so much depended on a speedy rescue. On Wednesday night, after 36 hours of almost ceaseless watching on the pit bank, the women were persuaded to go home. One girl, however, who had a sweetheart below, refused to leave her post in spite of all entreaties. He for whom she was thus patiently waiting was employed in one of the lowest parts of the mine, from which he never returned. On Thursday it became apparent that the mine would have to be abandoned, for, in addition to the mass of debris, heavy falls of earth had taken place. The presence of inflammable gas was also felt. So dangerous did it appear to penetrate farther, that the engineer in charge felt it his duty to order the men to the surface. Had attempts been made to get farther up the workings after this, they would have been followed by additional sacrifice of human life without the slightest prospect of saving the entombed men. On Friday, the engineers definitely decided to suspend all further operations. Behind the obstructions, an immense volume of water had collected, which at any moment might burst through and sweep away the exploring parties. When this decision became known in the village, it occasioned the utmost distress. Some of the women resigned themselves to the inevitable, while others, hoping against hope, refused to shut the doors of their houses, so that those whom they were waiting for might be able to walk in without hindrance. One woman, who had lost her husband and 2 sons, attempted to go to the pit head and make her way to her husband and lads. Her friends had a most painful task to perform to keep her at home, for kind words and promises were of no avail. The Reverend John Pawley, Vicar of Audley, bears high testimony to the character of the men. He says, "Most of the entombed miners are my parishioners. I know all of them, and a more respectable, steady, and industrious lot of colliers I never knew. Among those still in the mine is Cartwright, the superintendent of the choir boys at Audley Church, and many others are members of the Bible class, which is held in the church every Sunday. Cartwright's wife, poor woman, was at the pit mouth from Monday morning until Wednesday, when I persuaded her to go home. The houses where the entombed miners lived are still as beautifully kept as in happier days, though the wives are worn out with anxiety and grief. One poor woman whose husband is down the mine has completely gone out of her mind. She is under the impression that she is taking a walk and that her husband is with her. Terrible, too, must have been the feelings of the brave fellows who had struggled so long and so nobly to save the lives of their comrades. But, though beaten, they were not disgraced. They had worked like giants, and no experiment was left untried that might lead to success. Their labour was uncrowned with the slightest reward, and there was little encouragement or gratification from which they could derive new life and vigour, yet they never seemed to tire. The consciousness of duty done was their only consolation. A relief fund was organised for the widows and orphans, and from every quarter help was sent. The Queen telegraphed a message of sympathy with the bereaved, and her admiration of the gallant efforts which had been made to rescue the entombed miners. Her Majesty also conferred the Albert Medal on William Dodd, the heroic under-manager, but for whose determined pluck the disaster would have been attended with even greater loss of life. At a meeting of the High Court of Foresters held a few months later, it was decided to present Brother William Dodd with an address in recognition of his heroic conduct in saving the lives of 47 members of the order in the lamentable catastrophe of the Dig Lake colliery. That concludes Chapter 12, and is the end of Section 6. Section 7 of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13. The Sole Survivor. On the 30th of May 1895, fire broke out at one of the pits of the Fifeshire main collieries near Dunfermline. The shaft is sunk to the Jersey seam 55 fathoms down, and to the Loch Galley seam at the depth of about 70 fathoms. One large open furnace at the foot of the Jersey upcast shaft was always kept burning to rarefy the air, but a few days before it was found necessary to kindle 2 additional fires on account of the stifling nature of the atmosphere. These fires must have overheated the woodwork lining the upcast, and the fire broke out with scarcely any warning. Shortly after the men had stopped work, the manager noticed a tremendous volume of smoke proceeding from the Jersey seam. He at once descended and found the wood round the furnace in flames. He quickly set about stopping the air current, and also ordered a number of men to go to the bottom of the lock galley seam to cut off all communication. Having set the men to work, he descended to the lower seam to see how those there were getting on. He had not been down many minutes when he heard shouts and cries proceeding from the Jersey. Fearing that an accident had happened, he ascended, but instead of stopping at the seam, the cage, probably through a misunderstanding, was drawn to the pit head. In passing, the manager had felt an intense heat at the Jersey seam, and he lost no time in lowering the cage. When it came up, it contained 4 men, all of whom were terribly burned and suffering awful agony. The cage was sent down a second time, and returned with 3 miners in a similarly wretched plight. Doctors were sent for, and the poor fellows were conveyed to the hospital. The injuries they had received were of a most fearful kind. Their hands and faces were blistered and swollen, and their bodies were scorched all over. It was not thought that their condition was dangerous, and when the news spread next morning that 7 had died, it created a painful sensation. The doctors said that the injuries the men had received were not so much due to direct burning from flames as to confinement in an atmosphere heated to a high degree. This was shown by the fact that while the skin peeled off their faces and other parts of their bodies, their beards were only slightly scorched. They had also been compelled to inhale large quantities of heated coal dust, and this accounted in some measure for the comparative suddenness of death. It was at first thought that all the men had been brought out of the pit, but it was discovered that 2 were still missing. The manager called for volunteers to accompany him down the shaft, and 2 men came forward. They continued to search for some time, but no trace of the missing men could be found. The explorers therefore concluded that a mistake must have been made, and returned to the surface. Those on the bank were equally positive that Frank and Thomas Sharp were still underground. Regardless of the danger they incurred, the rescuers made a second and a third descent. On this occasion they were lowered right down to the bottom of the shaft at the lock galley seam. There they found the lifeless bodies of the 2 Sharps. They had died a terrible death. While endeavouring to escape from the Jersey seam in the blinding smoke, the darkness, and the intense heat, they had rushed headlong into the lower shaft and were dashed to the bottom, a distance of 12 fathoms. In half an hour after the outbreak was noticed, the upcast shaft and the pit head were practically wrecked. The shaft was lined from top to bottom with wood, which fed the blaze. Some idea of the fury of the conflagration may be formed from the fact that the flames rose 60 feet into the air, 20 feet above the winding drum. All the men who lost their lives were employed at the time in stopping the air courses with a view to overcoming the flames. Few of the poor fellows can have realised the tremendous risk they ran. So long as the flames ascended the upcast shaft, the danger was not so great, but whenever the air current was changed, through the burning material falling down the shaft, large volumes of smoke and heat were sent towards them with fatal effect. Lockhart Blellock, the sole survivor of the miners who were engaged in the perilous work of driving back the flames, describes his escape. He says, "I went down into the pit at 6:30 in the morning and worked away as usual until about 2:15 o'clock. I had occasion to come to the bottom of one of the shafts at that hour, and on passing the upcast shaft, Alexander Thompson, the pit inspector, cried to me, 'Come here, the woodwork of the upcast shaft has caught fire.' There is a big tank of water at the bottom of the mine, and we at once got pails and commenced to pour water on the flames. We very soon found that our work was of no use, and I really began to think we had got into a bad job. Seeing that we could do no good, I stopped pouring water and rushed to the workings and told the men to run because the upcast shaft was on fire. All the men in the section at once put on their clothes and we rushed to the bottom in the hope of getting to the surface. When we reached the level leading to the jersey seam bottom of the upcast shaft, we met the manager, and he asked Thomas Sharp and me to go and build an airtight stopping to cut off the draught. We worked for about half an hour, and gradually the air became so bad that it was with difficulty the lamps could be kept in. At this stage the manager came along and asked us how we were getting on. We replied that we should require assistance, and he sent old Frank Sharp to give us a hand. I had my side of the stopping built up, and old Frank had almost finished his, when a terrible crash took place in the upcast shaft, and the flames burst upon us. The air from this point turned, and our lights went out. We saw it was no use doing any more, and began to rush for the downcast shaft. We found it a difficult matter to pilot our way in the dark down the incline, and we got hold of the signal wire, and by this means got into the roadway leading to the bottom of the shaft. As we went along, we found the heat near the roof so intense that we were compelled to crawl on our hands and knees. Before we had gone far in this way, I heard Tom Sharp cry out, "I am choking." I replied, "Come away, we are nearing the bottom and may get up." Tom Sharp seemed to make a determined effort after this, for I found them both striking up against my heels. Here I became so faint and confused that I have only a faint recollection of what happened. I remember, however, that, on nearing the bottom, I struck against my clothes and pick where I had laid them down when I was called away to the stoppings. I then knew that I was going right into the mouth of the pit, and ran a danger of falling from the jersey to the Lochgelly seam. I made a turn and went round the back of the pit, and on groping about I could not find the Sharps. I suppose the poor men had gone straight on and had fallen to the bottom of the shaft, where they were found. On getting a faint glimmer of light, I found Thompson signalling for the cage to come down. When it came, we got in and were carried to the surface. I then realised for the first time the struggle I had had for life. I soon recovered my strength, and now I am suffering more from a stroke with a stone which fell on me from the roof than from any burns. This painful disaster made 8 women widows and rendered about 40 children fatherless. As one man remarked, "I hope I never live to see such another scene as yon. The cage came up, the men fell out of it anyhow, screaming and roaring with the pain. We could do nothing to help them, for the flesh came off where we touched them. It was an awful sight. The rest of the men were crying like bairns. That concludes Chapter 13. The section continues with Chapter 14. A Band of Heroes. "Bob, see this stream of water coming in off the coal," said William Jackson to Robert Park, who was working near him at the No. 4 Alconharvey pit near Saltcoats about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Friday the 2nd of August 1895. "If there are any waste workings here," replied Park, "I would say that's waste water. If I see the oversman tonight, I'll let him know." The two miners went on with their work without a thought of danger, when suddenly Jackson found himself deluged with water. He hurriedly raised the alarm and tried to make good his escape. Before he had gone very far, the strength of the flood had increased enormously, and he was several times carried off his feet. Wet and fatigued, he would have perished had not one of his companions helped him along to a place of safety. At the time of the inrush, there were nearly 100 men in the workings. From the higher parts of the mine, the flood poured down in a resistless torrent. Immediately on the alarm being raised, Robert Park rushed off to warn his neighbours that they had better make for the shaft if they wished to save their lives. Heedless of his own safety, he ran along, crying out, "Run for your lives! The water is on us!" His warning was not lost. All who heard the shout abandoned their work and rushed through the rapidly rising waters to the bottom of the shaft. It would be difficult to say how many men owe their lives to Parks's self-sacrificing bravery. Nearly 30 miners succeeded in escaping by No. 4 shaft, while others were drawn up by No. 1. Nearly a mile from the place where they had been working. These men, in order to get to No. 1, had to face the downward rush of the torrent and to fight against masses of floating wreckage. The volume of water is described as being 3 feet high and 6 feet wide, and as carrying everything before it. The strong and vigorous aided the very young and those advanced in years. It was indeed a life and death struggle, in which were displayed many of those acts of heroism so conspicuous amongst miners when threatened with a great danger. Charles Bryan was at work at the bottom of No. 4 shaft when he was alarmed by a tremendous rush of water, and at once ran to warn the men working near of their peril. On his way he met a boy named John Magee, who was on the same errand. They lost their way in the darkness, got into the wrong road, and found that it was blocked at the end. They turned back just as the water came rushing down the workings in full force. Bryan took the boy on his back to carry him to the higher levels, but he had only gone a few yards when a fall of earth from the roof knocked him down. Magee was swept away by the current and never seen again. Bryan continued his way alone to the shaft when part of the roof fell in and rendered him unconscious. How long he lay in water he did not know. When he recovered, he made his way to No. 1 pit and was saved. A noble example of heroism was shown by James Mullen, a lad of 18. His younger brother, who had only been in the pit a few weeks, had his leg severely injured, and he carried him on his back. Unable to proceed farther owing to the depth of water, they sat down. James stuck to his brother and would not leave him. When last seen, they had entered a manhole, and the boy was sitting on his brother's knee. An attempt was afterwards made to rescue them, but without success. The passage was full of water. Robert McComb, while toiling along seeking a spot of safety for himself and his two boys, came upon a lad named Gillespie, who was exhausted and unable to proceed farther. Unmindful of the fact that he had enough to do to look after his own sons, he seized the lad and bore him safely to the shaft. Another miner named John Cowan was less fortunate. After struggling almost within reach of a place of refuge, he experienced the anguish of seeing his son swept from his grasp into the dark current from which he had just rescued him, and, alone, the horror-stricken father was left to fight the last few steps to safety. Meanwhile, news of the disaster had spread into the surrounding district, and large numbers of women and children soon rushed to the pit-head, where many touching scenes were witnessed, as husbands and fathers were found to have escaped. After a time, it became known that 14 men were missing. Among these was Robert Park, but for whose bravery the disaster would have been attended with great loss of life. It was thought that there were 5 of the imprisoned men in the upper workings and 9 in the lower. Of the latter, all were beyond doubt drowned. Without delay, a rescue party was organised, and went down to attempt the rescue of those in the upper workings. About 400 yards from the bottom of the shaft, the passage was found to be literally choked with overturned hutches of coal, sleepers, rails, pit props, and all manner of rubbish, about 40 yards thick. This mass, tightly packed as it was, formed a dam which stemmed the waters and caused them to flood the workings beyond. Seeing that it would take a long time to remove so vast an obstacle, it was decided to cut a passage through at the top. All Saturday the men worked with unabated vigour, and as each shift retired, worn out with their exertions, others were ready to risk their lives on behalf of their imprisoned comrades. No one knew what pent-up force was behind that barrier, which at any moment might burst and hurl the rescuers into eternity. As the relief party advanced, they were troubled with damp. Air pipes were therefore sent down the pit and fitted up in the road, and by means of fanners a plentiful supply of pure air was obtained. In spite of all precautions, the place afterwards became so hot that it was necessary to change the workers every 15 minutes. Still the work progressed rapidly, notwithstanding the fact that they were making their way through sludge, which in many cases they could only remove with their hands. At 11:30 on Sunday forenoon came the joyful news to the crowds around the pit-head that 5 men were alive. Their knocking had been heard quite distinctly. An hour and a half later, the last obstruction was cut through, and the 5 men, including Robert Park, were rescued from their perilous position. Hearty were the cheers which rang out as each of the miners came to the surface and were driven to their homes. Though pale, they did not seem to have suffered very severely from their long confinement. Charles Clark, one of the survivors, said that he did not know what had happened till he found the water rushing down the main roadway. He at once made for the higher levels. On the way he came upon Park, jammed to the roof with floating debris. He was bleeding profusely about the head, but complained chiefly of having received a severe blow on the chest. Clark succeeded in freeing Park, and together they continued towards the higher levels. They next met another miner named McAdam, and shortly afterwards other two, McCarroll and Hamilton. On the way Park became faint, but he persevered manfully. Though himself hardly able to stand, he encouraged his companions and aided them with his intimate knowledge of the pit. A sudden rush of water, of greater volume than before, compelled them to take refuge for a time in a manhole. When the torrent had passed, they made another attempt to regain their freedom, only to be beaten back by chokedamp. Up to this time their lights had burned well, but the bad air extinguished them, and for the first time the little party abandoned themselves to despair. All now seemed hopeless. In every direction escape appeared impossible. With poisonous chokedamp on all sides of them, in which even the lights of their lamps could not live, and with a raging torrent of water carrying everything before it in the rear, they were indeed in a terrible plight. McCarroll attempted to discover a way through the wall of rubbish which blocked the passages from floor to roof, but in vain. They next turned their attention to the air courses, in the hope to see if the damp had lifted. Again they were baffled. Dispirited and exhausted, they sat down. Sleep was impossible, for in the bad air it would have resulted in death. For 2 hours they sat in momentary expectation of death. Then McCarroll said, "Let every man of us go on our knees and pray." Fervent were their supplications for aid, and they rose from their knees refreshed. Park next suggested to McCarroll that he "micht write 2 or 3 lines on a flask, just our names, and where we've been, and what we've done." A brief narrative of the occurrence was accordingly scratched on a tin flask with a pin. Still they remained inactive, for they thought it was better to sit there and die than be drowned. Suddenly Park came forward with another proposal. Why should they not attempt to force their way through the damp in the hope of finding purer air beyond? It was death anyway, so why not risk it? They made a dash through it, only to be beaten back. McAdam then suggested that they should tie their handkerchiefs over their mouths. This was done, and, headed by Park, they again set out. After penetrating several yards of damp, they reached purer air. What followed is best described in the words of one of the men. He says, "I got on to the top of the barricade and got through as far as I could, working with my fingers and crawling along as I cleared the way in front. I thought I heard a sound on the other side, and I cried to the others, but they said they had only heard the echo I made with my scraping. I lay quiet and listened. I heard 5 regular chaps, or knocks. Says I to those behind me, 'Do you hear that?' And they replied that they did. The sound put new life into us. Every man took his turn at the hole, scraping and tearing, whiles with his hands and whiles with the shovel. They had cut about 26 yards when the rescue party came upon them and relieved them from all further toil and apprehension. There were still 9 men and boys missing, and the search for them was actively carried on. Hours and days passed, and the search parties had nothing to report but failure. All they had to show for toil endured and dangers encountered was a poor little bundle of what may be called relics of their lost comrades: a pick, a belt, 2 caps, and a dinner can. On the 7th the search was reluctantly abandoned. The tale of the Alconharvey disaster is a fitting termination to these stories of underground valour. The judgment, calmness, and resource under circumstances which would unnerve most men, and the self-denying devotion and true nobility of character in the face of death which have been conspicuous throughout, are present in all their beauty and grandeur. Such actions are among the highest achievements of humanity, and the world is too poor to willingly forget them. That concludes Chapter 14, and is the end of Section 7. End of Stories of the Coal Mine by Frank Mundell.